Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we can start. It is 11 o'clock on my watch. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you can all hear me well. We will take my face off the screen at a later stage just to improve the connection while I talk. So my name is Cobus Theron, and I work for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. I'm the program manager for the Drylands Conservation Program, and I've been working for the Endangered Wildlife Trust for about 8 years. And since 2016, I've been working within the Drylands Conservation Program. So I've been very fortunate over the last couple of years to work for the private sector, for government, and for various NGOs. And I've been able to work in KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape and the Northern Cape. So it's a great privilege to be able to work in all of these areas, exposed to such a broad range of environments. I'm not a specialist in any field particularly, but I'm a generalist conservationist, and I've been in the conservation industry for over 25 years now. So I'm also very privileged to have had an uninterrupted career in conservation for this time. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about farming today in the Karoo and just give some of our perspectives on farming and the way forward in terms of the trends that are being experienced by farmers and the challenges that are being experienced by farmers, and then also looking at what farmers, how perhaps new opportunities exist in the landscape. So it's really about the idea of the fact that can things continue as they have been in the past? And I want to really talk about what prevents us from farming the way we did in the past. What new challenges are farmers facing that were maybe not present many, many years ago? So I also just want to state that I do live on a farm, an operational farm. I do have livestock, and so I am very acutely aware of the challenges that farmers have to deal with on an everyday basis. So as I said, I'm not an expert in the Karoo or any specific biome, but we do work in this area. We are currently running a sustainable land management program, and through my travels within Karoo, I am fortunate enough to travel. I'm able to meet a variety of people in government, on farms, farm workers, people in little towns, and I'm able to gain their perspectives on what is happening in the Karoo and in the Platteland. So it's from these experiences that I'd like to talk today. And also, whilst we are implementing our sustainable land management project as part of the GEF funding, the Global Environmental Facility funding, which is administered by the Department of Environmental Affairs and the United Nations Development Program, we are learning and seeing the challenges firsthand, and I'd like to discuss some of those. I don't have answers to all of these things. I don't think many people do. I'm also acutely aware that a number of people that are listening in today are experts in the field of the Karoo, and so your inputs later on during conversation or pertinent questions or topics for discussion would also be really useful. Before we start, I'd just like to talk a bit more about what the Drylands Conservation Program does. So the Drylands Conservation Program is a program within EWT. As you know, EWT is structured around a variety of programs that either focuses on species or on people's involvement in the environment or on habitats, and we are a habitat program. So we focus on unique drylands or Karoo habitats and the species that occur there. So for example, as you know, we are involved in the conservation of the critically endangered riverine rabbit. We are also looking into some dune-dwelling golden moles on the west coast, and then we also are looking at other species like Karoo dwarf tortoise, etc. We achieve our objectives through research on species and habitat, through securing habitat with working with farmers in voluntary agreements, and also we promote the sustainable land management of land in the Karoo. I just also want to let you know who the people are that are supporting us, because funding in the Karoo is always not an easy thing to achieve. And we have very loyal and very gracious supporters like the Zoological Societies for Species and Populations from Germany supporting us, Rand Merchant Bank, the Global Environmental Facility, Global Wildlife Conservation, and also the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Fund, and also some private donors. So these people make it possible for us to do our work, and we're very grateful for that. Also, we do not work in isolation in these landscapes, and we work very well with Cape Nature, the Northern Cape Department of Environmental Affairs and Conservation, as well as the various departments of agriculture in the Western and Northern Cape, and also to some extent in the Eastern Cape. And then lastly, we also collaborate quite extensively with other NGOs. And yeah, so just to talk a bit about the Karoo. So there's many definitions around what the Karoo is, how big it is, where it stops, where it starts. For our purposes today, we'd like to focus on the fact that our understanding of Karoo, which is that area that's marked 116,000 square kilometers, and also the Nama Karoo, which is that area marked 284,200 square kilometers. And that area is roughly the size of Germany. And that area contains about 1 million people if we include towns in the Klein Karoo like Oudtshoorn and Worcester. So it's really a really huge area. And as I said, we're fortunate to be in that area and to work there. And as we move on, I also want to just make the impression on you that I had an artist on the West Coast draw these tiles for us, and obviously they are riverine rabbits. And as you can see, within these pictures are elements from the landscape that are embedded, the sheep and the windmill. And what these pictures really, the message I really want to carry across with these pictures is that in the Karoo, farming and conservation are deeply intertwined. And it's not about the one or the other. So improved farm management, improved sustainable land management benefits species in the Karoo. And in fact, farmers are our greatest allies for conservation in the Karoo. As you know, the Karoo is very large and it's still not that well protected in terms of conservation. So our real allies in the area are the farmers. And we work very narrowly and closely with them, as you will see. Now, today, the way my talk is going to go is I'm going to talk to you a bit about farming and the challenges and the opportunities. But at the same time, the slides that you're going to see are just going to be general images of the Karoo. I want to share with you my passion and excitement for the Karoo and this wonderful landscape that is, it's mesmerizing and it's really diverse. So a lot of people travel through the Karoo, they drive on the N1, and they've got a specific idea of what the Karoo looks like. And you know, when you drive in a car, you don't notice the small things. And today I want to share with you some of those small things. And I want to share with you the fact that the Karoo is actually quite diverse. And so while I talk, you will be seeing these images of the diverse Karoo. I've also just put in kind of like a little sentence in each slide to show where it is and what you're kind of looking at. And I encourage you to maybe just have a pencil and a piece of paper with you, because so that if you listen to what I'm talking, you can make notes if there's questions that you want to ask at a later stage or issues you want clarified. And perhaps also open Google Earth on your computer or on a tablet, or have an atlas at hand, and you can see where some of these places are. Perhaps you know them, perhaps they're new to you, but really the aim of my talk and the reason why I share these pictures is, besides the fact that we want to talk about farming and the challenges in terms of that, for the Karoo in the Northern Cape and the Western Cape, I also just want to share this wonderful landscape with you. I think it's absolutely fantastic. In this time where we're all under lockdown situation, it was just fantastic for me to put all of these photographs together and think about all of these fantastic places that we visit and so forth. And then remember also at the end, you are able to ask questions, and I will also answer those questions to the best of my ability. If I can't answer those questions, we will come back to you at a later stage. We can take your details, or you can take my details, and we will come back to you with specific answers. So just in terms of the Karoo, and I'll go back to the previous slide, you know, as I said, it's quite a large area. The main vegetation biomes is the succulent Karoo and the Nama Karoo. The overarching activity in this area is extensive livestock grazing, and agriculture is obviously one of the main economic drivers. You'll find that there's possibly around about 100 different towns in the area that we are describing, and there are many social issues in these towns. There's extreme poverty in these towns, and there's limited access to quality education in many of these areas. So these are some of the challenges that we have to deal with. Also, when we look at the Karoo, you know, I read a lot of articles where people say it's a harsh and unforgiving landscape, and I use all of these words to describe the Karoo, but actually, in my opinion, the Karoo is a fairly fragile place. And while it's got a great ability to rebound after periods of drought, it is so that once we exceed certain thresholds in terms of the soil or the vegetation, then our trouble begins, and it's really, really difficult to fix those. So the Karoo is home to the largest variety of succulents on the planet. Interestingly enough, Karoo wool, we were speaking to a farmer the other day who's involved in the wool industry. Karoo wool is some of the highest quality wool in the world. You know, the Karoo is also a global tortoise hotspot, and soon we'll be releasing a tortoise poster, so keep your eyes open for that. I'm sure we will be retailing some of them through the e-shop that we have. And then also the Karoo is a shifting landscape, and what I mean with that is you'll find that many of the small towns are starting to depopulate, or economic activity is receding from the small towns, and people are moving to the larger Karoo towns where there's greater opportunities for employment, etc. So many of the smaller Karoo towns are really having a tough time socioeconomically to survive. And we'll get to this at a later stage because it bears implication, you know, in terms of our talk today. So before we go on, I'd like to, for those of you who know the Karoo, it's tempting to look at this picture that I'm demonstrating now and then, you know, wonder where in the Karoo is this? You know, there could be many places. It's reminiscent of some areas along the N1, etc. As you drive down the Karoo, but the reality is that this picture that I'm showing you now has got nothing to do with the Karoo. In fact, it was taken in Mpumalanga. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture is this is an area that receives more than 600 to 700 millimeters of rain. And this denudation of vegetation and the fact that the landscape is bare solely relates back to the management of the land and how people have been managing the land. And that's what we'll be talking about today in terms of sustainable land management. This is not what we want. And in fact, most areas in the Karoo are probably in a better condition than this picture that I'm showing you now. So it's interesting that it's not just arid areas don't, you know, you can have this kind of effect in an area that receives a lot of rainfall if the management of the land is incorrect. Right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, and from now I'm going to start my slideshow, and as I said, the pictures that you now are going to see are not directly related to my talk, although I'll be talking about farming, but these are just general images of the Karoo, and I'm sure you will find them enjoyable, and I hope that it inspires you to travel to the Karoo once the COVID lockdown has been lifted. Remember, the Karoo is a vast open place. It's got lots of space, and social distancing is really, really easy. So the best thing you could do after lockdown for the Karoo and for the people living in the Karoo is actually to travel into the Karoo and experience some of these places that I'll share with you now. So it will run automatically now, and I will go into my talk. Right, so as you can imagine, farming in the traditional ways are becoming increasingly more challenging in the Karoo. And today we're going to explore this a bit more. I don't have all the answers, but I'd like to, share with you some of the things that are happening, some of the difficulties people are facing within the Karoo, so that you can understand it. I realize that there are farmers listening in today as well, but my talk is also really geared towards people who don't know the Karoo and who don't know the difficulties that farmers are facing. As I said earlier on, I want to make it quite clear that farming and conservation in the Karoo are interrelated. They are two sides of the same coin, and it's not an either-or situation. I think it's very important to bear that in mind. Farmers are our custodians of land in the Karoo. So they are our most important conservation partners. And it is very important that we strike up collaborative agreements and arrangements with farmers, because they are the people who are basically in charge or manage the heritage of these arid areas. So sometimes we, when sketching a situation that is moving towards one end of the spectrum where things are changing, we refer to it in business terms as a burning platform. And I want to talk to you about the burning platform that the Karoo is experiencing. And I'm not literally talking about a burning platform, but why is farming, or the conditions facing farming, why are they becoming more challenging, or how are things changing? So the first thing that is quite obvious is, whether or not climate change will impact this area and what the effects of climate change will be for these areas. And it's quite difficult, whilst we know that these areas in the Karoo and the western parts of South Africa are geared to become much hotter, probably drier, and probably with more intermittent, very heavy rainstorms. I think that it's very difficult from a scientific point of view to demonstrate exactly where we are on that curve, whether climate change has actually started already, whether it's something that's in our near future. So if you review the literature, I read a paper 2 days ago, which demonstrated that some of the winter rainfall areas, what we're observing in some of the winter rainfall areas in the Karoo is not really climate change. It's just part of the natural cycle. Whether that's true for the summer parts, I'm not quite sure. But if you ask people living in the landscape, for them, they feel, many of the people feel that something is changing, that it's becoming harder, that droughts are being felt more intensely. So if climate change, and when climate change comes into this area, what are we going to be expecting here? So obviously warmer temperatures in an area that's already very, very warm. So obviously that brings increased evaporation to mind. It also makes it more difficult for plants that are germinating to actually make it to adulthood, or to get, to become settled in the soil. There's an increased risk of fire, likely in some of the areas, especially areas which has got reasonable cover and which are subject to quite strong winds. So, this is not good, because the Karoo is not a fire-driven system. And ideally, you don't want fires too often in the system. There's possible changes in species composition of plants, and that may actually have implications for species living in the landscape. And then we know that the intensity of droughts are going to become more pronounced, and maybe the frequency of these droughts will become more regular. We also know that there's going to be changes in the amount of groundwater that's available. And already many boreholes in the Karoo are experiencing, drops in groundwater levels. And it's more difficult for farmers to find water in their boreholes. Yields are decreasing, and farmers are finding that they have to drill new boreholes. You will all recall a couple of months ago how we were struggling across a net to actually locate more water for people, how drilling had to go deeper, and how new areas had to be explored. And many of these higher temperatures will also indirectly affect the indigenous species that live in these areas. And this is especially true of certain reptiles like tortoises, etc., and also of certain species like, for example, the endangered riverine rabbit, which we believe also has a heat tolerance attached to it. So it doesn't want to be in areas where mean temperatures are above a certain average. So obviously, as I said, climate change is a big worry. It's on our doorstep already, and it's debatable whether the effects of what we're seeing now already is part of that or not. But it's coming, and as I said, local people will already tell you it's here. So we've had one of the worst droughts during living memory over the last 4 years in large parts of the Karoo. It's had a devastating impact in areas like Sutherland, where in many farms there's simply no grazing left, and farmers had to feed. Feeding is enormously expensive and has economic impacts for farmers. And so we find in our work that especially small farmers, now small is relative in the Karoo, a small farm is probably something under 10,000 hectares or so, but we found that farmers are struggling, while larger farmers, especially farmers with multiple farms, are able to move livestock and are able to rest plants better, are slightly better off. We've also seen that farms where farmers have different income streams are better able to make sustainable land management decisions for their farms than where a farmer only has 1 or 2 income streams. So the current drought has had an enormous impact, and whether that's part of the climate change cycle or it's just part of the normal cycle, it has changed farming in the Karoo for probably a number of decades to come. And it has caused a number of people to abandon farming or to try and explore other sources of income. And this has an impact on the small town economies, and of course it's not desirable. So it has also been a major challenge for many of the farmers that we deal with. And of course, when there's no grazing around for farmers, and for sheep, then there's also very little to eat for indigenous game and wild endangered species. So, one of the things that also knocks on the EWT's door quite often is a number of developments that are proposed for the Karoo. And many of these developments are often or they look tempting in the beginning. They look like they could be options for the Karoo, but actually they're fairly unsustainable, and they worry from a biodiversity conservation perspective. So as you know, for the last couple of years, we've had quite an issue around fracking and whether or not that will proceed or not. And fracking is very tempting for people who are looking for jobs. And of course, there's a large amount of unemployed people in the Karoo. And so the prospect of fracking is a prospect of jobs for many. But we've said that, and we've seen that this is often a false economy, in the sense that fracking jobs are temporary. Fracking jobs are normally associated with skilled people, which perhaps are not in the Karoo. So the jobs are actually for people coming in from the outside. And the major problem we've seen with fracking in the Karoo is the large volumes of water that are required. And we just know that water is not there. And in the future, given what I previously described, it's unlikely to get better. And so the threat of water abstraction for the Karoo as a whole is a very dangerous and untenable thought. So while fracking looks attractive, there's many issues that need to make us very concerned about this activity should it proceed. Fortunately, the oil price has dropped to historic lows, and under these situations, fracking actually becomes economically unviable, and so that will have an effect on the plans for fracking going forward. I think it's also interesting just to note that a study was conducted a couple of years ago by the CSIR, and if you look at that study very carefully, under a medium exploration or a medium exploration scenario, the prospect of agricultural jobs lost is actually higher than the fracking jobs created. So under a medium extraction of shale gas in the Karoo, we'll find that more jobs in the agricultural and agritourism industry will get lost than actually will be created. Also, we have quite a lot of mining activities from time to time, and this peaked a couple of years ago. You will recall when South Africa was considering the nuclear reactors being built. There were 6 or 7 of them in the pipeline. A number of active applications for the Karoo to extract uranium. And, one can debate whether nuclear energy is a better form of energy or not. But for the Karoo, it's a big problem because that's where the uranium will be dug out. That's where the impact will be felt. And we've seen that these areas are not well rehabilitated after mining takes place. And so mining, in my opinion, represents also a challenging economic development for many parts of the Karoo, and not something that will necessarily leave the Karoo and people of the Karoo better off in the long term. And then obviously we have a large number of renewable energy plants that are coming up in the Karoo. And obviously, it's a mixed result here, because obviously moving to a low carbon future, renewable energy, solar and wind are highly desirable over coal and other forms. But again, in certain instances, there is a biodiversity risk. And before these things are planned and placed, we need to be very careful where they go so that the biodiversity impacts are minimized. Yet, in my opinion, planned correctly provides the opportunity perhaps for limited job creation, and from a South African perspective, a valuable contributor to our energy mix. So one of the other issues that face Karoo farmers quite frequently is also the impact of passive degradation. What I mean by this is that over the years, the Karoo has been farmed for many centuries, actually, 2 or 3 centuries, and or since the mid 1700s. And if there's been damage, if there's been overgrazing, and if there's been erosion, often these impacts will carry on if there's no positive steps taken to rectify them. As I've illustrated earlier to you, that there are thresholds perhaps, and when these thresholds are overstepped, fixing the problem in the Karoo becomes very, very difficult. One also has to bear in mind that vegetation is highly dependent on rainfall. So in areas where there's low rainfall, vegetation grows slowly, and many of the plants in the Karoo are actually much older than what you'd find in the east of the country, like annual grasses, etc. Many of the plants might appear very small, but they've actually been there for many, many years. And what I'm trying to illustrate is that change in the landscape, change in the vegetation takes place very gradually and has to take place over many years and of many years of good felt management to actually get a result that's visible. And then, we've been, within our program, we've been looking at rehabilitation of Karoo areas. And the worrying part of the rehabilitation is that while it's very, very necessary, rehabilitation is expensive. And in many instances, rehabilitation actually costs more per hectare than actually purchasing more on fixing a hectare in Calvinia than it would actually cost you to buy a hectare in Calvinia of good land. So for farmers, this presents a dilemma as well, because it requires investment in land that economically, even if you farmed it, would take many, many years to return. And then, the whole issue around rising costs and rising risks around farming has also increased. And so we find that transport costs have increased till very recently. Labor costs, or the complexity around labor on farms, have become more difficult to manage. It's difficult to attract and retain skilled labor in the Karoo. Lots of people want to move to towns and cities where there's bigger services available. And then the threat of expropriation of agricultural property also makes that farmers don't want to, or that makes them reluctant to invest in their property. It makes them reluctant to think about rehabilitation on their properties. So these are some of the challenges that face farmers and influence farming and productivity of the land. And then, the other question that we never ask ourselves is what is happening to the farmers themselves? So many of you might not be aware, but the average age of farmers in South Africa is 62 years. And so there's a lot of commercial farmers that are retiring, and many of these farmers, their children are not coming into farming. So there's a shrinking demographic around a certain group of farmers. Also, we've got a large contingency of emerging farmers coming, or emerging commercial farmers coming into the landscape. But often these emerging farmers are placed on leased land. So they have to lease land from government. And typically these leases are 10 or 15 years in length. And it actually has a a disinvestment or incentive against investment. Because if I'm not sure that my lease will be renewed, then I might be scared to invest in my farm. So while it's very nice to have new farmers on the land, we need to make sure that the new farmers have a vested interest in the landscape and that they actually own farms, and that, you know, that they have longer leases or actually tenure rights to these farms so that they can look after the properties, and, you know, that they really feel they can invest in the farms. And then, of course, lately we've been seeing a lot of the farms changing hands and becoming lifestyle properties. And one can argue whether this is a good or a bad thing. We see a lot of lifestyle farmers are very open to the idea of conservation. And so it's easy people to work with as well, because their income comes from another source. And so it's easy for them to make decisions around farming. But we also see lifestyle farms where things are not going, trying to farm without the knowledge, where they're trying to bring in species perhaps, or game, or other, you know, other farming types, and they don't understand the landscape. They're not from that landscape, and they don't have the experience, and often things go south. So we have a mixed view of, you know, the lifestyle farmers, and, you know, in some cases it's very positive. People are bringing new enthusiasm, new energy, new skills and resources into the landscape, and they're enthusiastic about conservation. And in other areas it's not quite the same. So these are some of the things that are really challenging, you know, the climate, the resources, the way the global economy is changing. Even now with COVID, we might actually find new challenges in terms of getting produce to the landscape, or, you know, to the producers, and so forth. And you know, really, what are the options? How do people extract themselves? How do farmers move forward? And this is a really difficult question to answer. What we know from our experience in the landscape is that we need to try and promote sustainable land management practices, more so now than ever before. We need to have the veld resilient. That means that, you know, when there's a drought, or when there's a fire, or when there's an adverse environmental condition, we need to be able to have veld that can bounce back. And to do that, we need to make sure that practices on the land are sustainable. And the principles of that sustainable land management really are not difficult. And one of the most fundamental of these is the ability for veld to rest. Farmers need to create the opportunity for veld to rest, because without rest, we don't have flowers in the veld, and without flowers, we don't have seed, and without seed, there's no stock to rejuvenate the soil and the plant life after adverse event. We also need to start looking at, in terms of livestock, looking at quality over quantity. More important to be looking at, you know, the quality of my stock rather than how many animals I have. And that relates back to rest of veld, to rotational grazing, etc. We need to be looking at protecting our riparian areas on farms, because these are the gold of the Karoo. Those riparian areas are not only important for critically endangered riverine rabbits, but they're also important as areas where there's more moisture and where there's greater productivity in plants, and consequently opportunities for grazing. So these areas need to be protected and managed properly. And as I said earlier on, we want to improve the resilience of the veld. And that means ground cover, species diversity, seeds, flowers, and root reserves. Recently also the Wool Growers Association has released some sustainable wool standards, or responsible wool standards, and farmers are encouraged to participate in those because they address many of these issues that we've been talking about today. So as I mentioned earlier on, we find that farms where diversified activities take place are better placed to make sustainable decisions, or decisions about sustainable land management. And you know, the question farmers need to ask themselves are whether or not you know, there's a possibility to engage in other farming activities, maybe beyond sheep and cattle. Are there opportunities to add value to products before they go to markets? And is there a possibility for Karoo produce to be branded, certified, and marketed to fetch better prices? Can we diversify income streams away from just farming, looking at agritourism? Okay, that's not, it's not necessarily the case for all farms. You know, there are farmers where this is not possible, but there are also farms where it is possible. Are there opportunities for conservation on farms? And as we are speaking, there are many people in South Africa looking at developing innovative financing streams to see whether or not we can fund conservation on private land in different ways. And while we're not there yet, I think the future might be exciting going forward in that respect. Farm experiences, you know, people are yearning for getting out, doing something different. And I suspect in the post-COVID world, that might be even more relevant. And then farming enterprises, you know, niche products, weaving, you know, that kind of thing is something that we need to look into. We need to actually start developing new models around farms. We need to look at farms individually as business units and look at what can work in those areas and what may not be able to work in those areas, and come up with almost like a business plan for farms and for farmers. Obviously, when I say for farmers, by farmers, for farmers. And then I think the new world in terms of digital technology, of the fourth industrial revolution, the things that make this call and this presentation possible today are opening new possibilities. We're already busy in Loxton training people. They're doing online diplomas in agriculture. Previously, that opportunity would be unheard of in an area like Loxton because it's just too far from anywhere. Now people are training at our e-learning center and they're getting degrees in Loxton, never having to move away from Loxton, and this opens new opportunities for training. There's also an ever-increasing platform for starting to make a living online, and I know this is very far still for many people in the Karoo, far into the future, but we need to start investigating these things. If we look at also many of the activities in the Karoo, things that are happening in the Karoo, if you think about the Meerkat, the square kilometer array, and all the renewable energy projects in Karoo, there's a real need for people with technical, online and technical expertise. And we should be trying to create opportunities for people in the Karoo for this. And then I think what's desperately needed also is we need to use these platforms for increased collaboration, talking to one another more, getting farmers to collaborate across regions more. And that's where we'll raise new ideas, develop new concepts, and look at how to take the economy, the people, and farming in the Karoo forward. So it's very important that we develop economic alternatives for the Karoo, because if we don't develop these economic alternatives for the Karoo, unsustainable options remain very attractive and people will want to go down those roads. We have to give people in the Karoo hope and give them a sense of pride. And I'm not saying they don't have a sense of pride, but I'm saying that, you know, people need to be excited to be living in the Karoo, and we need to all work together to try and create that excitement and that setting for people. And I think that there needs to be a deeper collaboration between conservationists and farmers to understand the interrelationship between farming and conservation, and to, as I mentioned earlier on, to find new models to drive that. So yeah, the COVID-19 pandemic might also be a blessing in disguise for the Karoo. Obviously, it's you know, it's very regrettable that we're in this situation, and you know, it's highly problematic. But there might be actually opportunities arriving out of COVID-19 for the Karoo. If we think about people who are working remotely, maybe after all of this, the remote workforce in South Africa will grow, and these people might be looking at moving out to smaller towns in the Karoo, if provided that there's enough bandwidth. Many properties in the Karoo are very well priced. Many areas in the Karoo are very safe, and it might be wonderful places to work from home. And you know, you might see an influx of people coming into the area, hopefully bringing new skills and also resources. Low volume tourism might become a mainstream tourism trend. In a world where we have to do some social distancing, the Karoo might be the perfect place just to do that. And then traceable farm products, we're also seeing that trend globally. Traceable farm products are going to become even more sought after in the marketplace. And I think the Karoo has got enormous potential advantage there, especially in some of the produce that it produces. I also think that, you know, while the Karoo is far away from many of us, actually as a domestic tourism destination, it's quite central. It's quite close to Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, George, Bloemfontein, and to drive instead of fly becomes an option to visit the Karoo. And perhaps the dry climatic conditions may also prove to be advantageous for health going down the line. So the promotion of sustainable land management practices, to conclude then, is really essential. Farming and conservation in the Karoo is highly viable, but I think it's time to rethink the way that we do that. I think it's time to rethink collaborations and how do we proceed making a living and making the Karoo a good place to live and to make a life. I think it's very important that we assist emerging farmers in the Karoo, emerging commercial farmers, to leapfrog some of the mistakes that have been made and to try and arm them with knowledge and expertise and mentors and try to get them on the right track as quick as possible. I think it's important to highlight those farmers, to find those farmers in the Karoo that are really championing sustainable land management, that are doing things in a different way, that are leading the way, and to learn from these people and to actually adopt their techniques in the way that they're going forward. What I like to also think about is not only how the Karoo looks today. I think I'm really interested to see how the Karoo is going to look in 20 or 30 years' time. And I think we should be starting to think about what the Karoo will look like. What is the Karoo that we want to see in that time? And start to develop plans and work towards the Karoo that we want to see in 20 to 30 years' time. I look at the transformation in provinces like Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal, and it's a tremendous rate of transformation, to such an extent that these areas, as we know them in some of the eastern provinces, will be unrecognizable in 20 to 30 years' time if current development trends are taking place. So it's really about the Karoo being that area where we will still have space, and what will that space mean, and what are we going to do with that space? And that's really the end of my talk to some extent. Is the challenge is, what is the Karoo that we seek, and how will we get there, and how will we get there together, and how do we actually get farming and conservation to work together in a productive, meaningful way that has got meaning to all of the people living in the Karoo. I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and we will move towards answering some questions if I can. So I'm going to stop the screen now. We can bring my video up again, perhaps, so that you can see me. Right, and then I'll try to answer some of the questions that you've posed to me. So I'll go to the questions now. Right. Right, so somebody asks here, Ali asks, how much percentage of the Karoo is currently under protection? Sure, that's quite a difficult question. I haven't calculated that. So our largest protected areas in the Karoo at the moment are the Karoo National Park, the Tankwa National Park, the Namakwa National Park, and then also Naisberg and the Sandbona area that adjoins Naisberg. So I would say, these collectively are probably in the order of over 500,000 hectares. And that, while that sounds quite large, it's still quite a small proportion of the Karoo. I can tell you that, during the actual vegetation, when we assess vegetation for biodiversity stewardship sites, a large number of the Karoo vegetation types are not adequately protected by like 2 or 3 or 4% protected. So in other words, there's still a lot of room for improvement for many of the Karoo vegetation types. Somebody asks here, who's the artist that did those tiles for me? It's a lady called Gina de Oliveira. She's situated in, I think she's in Graafwater on the West Coast. If you email me, I'll give you my email address shortly. I see it didn't come up, but I will give it to you just now. I can put you in contact with her. Another questions, keep going with the photos if you can. I'm really sorry, I don't know what happened with the presentation. Will you share more beautiful photographs? Okay, we're going to try and put the presentation up on YouTube, and we'll try to put the full presentation up on YouTube at a later stage. Somebody says here, Marianne says that the opportunities for tourism, photographic and wildlife and wellness are limitless. I agree with you. I think it's just a question of pitching it to the right groups in the right way. And interesting that I didn't also mention in the beginning is the Karoo is actually one of the most inhabited dry areas or arid areas in the world. So it's really actually quite well inhabited. Mostly towns are 50 kilometers apart. And that's not something that we find in many of the other arid areas in the world. So it's really, it's a fantastic place. I'm just quickly scrolling through. Right, Eleanor agree with me that there might be opportunities for social distancing and ecotourism. Amy asks about Karoo farmers and their average age, and is there potential to train in new people as farm managers to run some of these farms as older people retire? I think what's happening at the moment is that many of the farms are not being used productively. The system that you're talking about is not really in place. And a lot of very large farmers are buying more land because, as I explained earlier, once you own a specific amount of land, it's actually easier to overcome some of the challenges. But yeah, I think there's a need to actually look at the people who are working on the farms and seeing whether or not, how do we fill the shoes of these people who are leaving the landscape with new farmers? Ali asks, is there any program aimed at training farmers in the Karoo? Yes, there is. We have developed an EWT a farming program. You can visit www.karooforever.org.za and you will see our training program on there. There are a number of specialist programs, but our program is more aimed as a general program. And you can have a look at the content of the program on the website. Sorry, the questions are coming in, so I just have to go in here. Christine asks whether or not there's a success story that we can relate between farmers and conservationists. And I think, yes, I think there are many success stories. EWT's history is filled with success stories between farmers and conservationists. I think at the moment, one of our success stories that we're currently working on in the Nieuwoudtville area is we are assisting a farmer to develop ecotourism on his farm, and in exchange the farmer is actually changing land management practices and has entered his farm into a voluntary conservation agreement with the Department of Environmental Affairs and Conservation in the Northern Cape. And so that's just one example of some of the success, and the number of farmers that are approaching us for stewardship. In other words, this voluntary agreement where we actually provide legal protection from a conservation perspective. That's also growing and people are very interested. Right, let me just, sorry, there's quite a number of questions. I'm just working through them quickly. Okay. Lindy asks, can you give us a summary of the impact of climate breakdown in the Karoo over the next 20 to 30 years? As I said earlier on, I think the debate is on whether climate change is already here or whether it's still on its way. It depends who you ask, but we definitely know we're going to be dealing with a hotter place with higher mean temperatures, with decreased rainfall probably for most part of the Karoo, although there might be exceptions, and then longer drought spells. So people will have to be more resilient. We'll have to manage our felt better so that it's more resilient, that it's able to bounce back better. Dennis says that he can't wait to get back to the Karoo after lockdown. Dennis, you're not alone. Right. So Katrina asks whether or not invasive plants, I haven't really mentioned invasive plants, and what is the prognosis in terms of climate change in invasive plants. So we know that many of the invasive plants like prosopis are carbon fixers, so they might benefit enormously from increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which means they grow faster and more vigorously, and obviously then also they use more water. So Katrina, yes, I think that the potential impact from alien vegetation is going to get worse if we don't deal with it. Yeah, so it's a very valuable comment. Thank you for that. Sorry, I'm just quickly going through the questions. So Lehman asks, what do you think the barriers are for farmers of the Karoo to move to more sustainable farming practices? I think there's a number of barriers. The first barrier, as I explained, is the more dependent you are on your farming, the more your farming consists out of one activity. Let's say, for example, sheep farming. The harder it's going to be for you, especially if you are farming in a smaller area, to change practices. It may be that moving across to sustainable farming practices actually does have a financial implication in the beginning. It might cost more to re-fence camps, to change watering points, to rest veld, to reduce stock. There might be costs involved here, and that might be a big barrier for people who are who farm on a medium to small sized farm and who have been farming the same way for a number of years. So the opportunity here is to look away from, try to diversify farming, try to create other income streams. And as I said, our experience is that people are then able to make decisions concerning sustainable land management easier. I also think that, as I explained earlier on, one of the barriers is that it takes many years for veld in the Karoo to change or to improve. And hence, we need to, it's not a quick fix. And not all of us have the luxury of time to wait until things change. And that's also a barrier, is we're stuck in this situation between surviving financially and economically, but wanting to improve the conditions on our farm, wanting to make changes on our farm. But it's just, how do we do that? How do we transition? Right, I'm going to go one final through some of these questions. Aura asks, is the Karoo still being protected during COVID-19? I think that, yes, the question to that is yes. I think farmers are doing their bit. Farmers are carrying on where they can. Fortunately, work on farms have not been so severely affected because farming is regarded as an essential service. And obviously our protected areas are still being protected by the organizations that are in charge for that. EWT has been in lockdown for a while. We were able to do some of our work remotely, but we will soon be going back into the field and taking up our physical, practical work in the field again. So we're very excited about that. Mel asks, have we encountered less persecution of large birds and raptors in the Karoo if farmers are becoming more conservation inclined? And the answer to this is, generally we see that there's a greater awareness amongst farmers for many conservation issues. But I'm sad to say that we still come across birds that are persecuted. We still have poisoning incidents, and we still have issues where birds are shot or trapped. These are not, it's not the overarching state of affairs, but it still happens, and it's disconcerting that in this time it's still happening. Karina Becker asks whether or not we can look at changing crops that are better suited to warmer and drier climates. So I think that there is that opportunity to look at other niche crops that can be grown and moving away perhaps from things that are water intensive. We are involved with a farmer near the Graaff-Reinet area that's looking at almost like an agro mix between planting trees and looking at growing crops under those trees or high value crops. So I think those are the types of experiments we need to start looking into. Yeah, so there's definitely opportunity for that, and definitely ways of farming more innovatively in terms of cropping and in terms of growing things and looking at high yield crops. Let me just see. So how does the government, Ruth wants to know, how does the government incentivize sustainable farming and change in farming practices, especially for long-time farmers? Ruth, while theoretically there might be incentives and ways forward on this, we don't see a lot of this in the landscape. I think, you know, the main incentive here must be the increase in the resilience of the veld and the increase in long-term productivity. So it's really up to the farmer to say, if I do these things, the benefit, the incentive is going to be better productivity, better resilience, increased stability going forward. So the incentives are almost in the way that I manage my farm. I would love to see incentives from government for sustainable farming. And we talk about this quite a lot at a high level, but quite frankly, other than the work that EWT and some of the other NGO partners are doing in the landscape, we still don't see a major push towards sustainable farming practices in South Africa as a whole. Government departments do have programs, and you know, the sharing of information is there, but it's not happening large scale, and that's regrettable, because in the age that we live in now, I think this should actually be a priority, given climate change, given where we're going forward, given the fact that we want to preserve livelihoods in these arid areas. We should be throwing a lot of resources into actually getting people to farm more sustainably, incentivize them, and provide assistance where we can. Good. Okay, so are there any last questions before we, I hope I haven't missed any pertinent questions. Are there any other questions before we conclude the talk? Dane asks, what is your opinion on farming with endemic flora and fauna as opposed to alien as a more sustainable way forward? So I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean, but you make reference to aloe ferox. So obviously there's great value in harvesting of indigenous plants, some of our fynbos species, some of our, you know, the aloe species, and also looking at, you know, maybe some of the more fragrant, you know, shrubs and bushes in the Karoo, and there's opportunities for that. I'm sure. I think one just needs to be careful in the sense that, you know, those things need to be developed with sustainability in mind. There's also processes that one has to go through in terms of permitting, etc., before you start using and harvesting indigenous products. So one has to be mindful of that. But given South Africa's biodiversity, I don't even think we've started to tap the potential that exists for looking at products which that are linked to our biodiversity, and it would be really, you know, far more desirable to look at exploring those options rather than looking at importing alien plants or carrying on with species that are not necessarily suited to the arid areas and which may even pose an invasive risk to the arid areas. So I hope that answers that question. Great. Okay, guys, I think I've answered most of the questions. I would like to thank you for your time here today with us. Let me just quickly see. There's another question here. Lisa Hester asks whether we covered issues like jackal, roycut, and these kind of predator problem animals. Sure, I'm not even sure I should have read that question. What a very topical and debatable issue. The whole thing around predation on farms. So yes, it is still a big issue on many farms in the Karoo. Many farmers have found ingenious ways to deal with the problem in a way that is environmentally friendly, and you know, and many farmers continue to carry on with the old ways, which, you know, we know don't necessarily work. The point is, there are progressive people out in the landscape who have found novel ways to actually manage their stock and manage their predation problem around jackal and roycut. So that is encouraging, and those are the people we need to learn from. Excellent. Well, if this is the case, I think thank you for all your questions. Thank you for listening. And remember, please, my request is that when COVID is over, when we're allowed to travel, the best thing you can do for the Karoo is to get in your car and visit the Karoo. Take a train or some form of carbon neutral traveling. A bicycle might even be better. Visit these places. We are so fortunate in this country to have this vast area on our doorstep, which is absolutely wonderful. And I appeal to you to look beyond. I mean, the landscape is fantastic, but look closer. Look at the smaller things, and you know, that's where the beauty of the Karoo lies. And don't be fooled about stereotypes of the Karoo. It's an absolutely diverse and wonderful place. So lastly, thank you again, and thank you for your time, and keep safe. We look forward to you participating in some of our other EWT webinars. Thank you very much.